BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history. And today's turning point is a much discussed one, a crucial one, though a fairly hidden one. Also says my guest Ussama Makdisi. Ussama, hello and thank you for joining me on the BlomCast.
It's good to be with you.
Ussama Makdisi, you are a professor of history at the University of California at Berkeley. You specialize in Middle Eastern history, in early modern Middle Eastern history, so really before the political fallout of what we are now seeing in the war in and on Gaza, but very much the world that created the conditions for that kind of thing to happen. But you also have a personal story that connects you to that. You are of Palestinian and I think Lebanese descendants, and you grew up in Lebanon. And you grew up in Lebanon during the wars there. Tell us a little bit about what makes a young historian.
What makes a young that's a very good question. What makes a young historian? What makes a historian ultimately is a decision to tell stories about the past and to relate, obviously, the present to the past and the past to the present. And typically, I think it's a commitment, in a sense, to telling the truth as best we can in a narrative form. And I think growing up in Lebanon, I realized in the context of the civil war there, which of course was waged formally between 1975 and 1989, 1990, it was very clear to me that the representations, even as a teenager, the representations of the war as being simply a religious war or a sectarian war between Christians and Muslims, for example, was a gross simplification, and that there were clearly other factors involved, and so that's really, in a sense, that and the fact that my mother is Palestinian, my father is Lebanese, and there's living in that environment, that pushed me to become a historian, to sort of delve into the extraordinarily rich history that there is in the Middle East, and at the same time, to combat the extraordinary and pervasive and still ongoing stereotypes and Orientalist representations of that part of the world.
I want to come to the Orientalism and those representations a little bit later, but just in a more concrete way, when you describe these stereotypes, I mean, they are part of all of our thinking. What we don't know well, we represent in very simplified ways, psychology tells us. And the further it gets away, the more simplified the version becomes. Certainly when I grew up in Germany, what I heard was about a religious war in Lebanon. Tell me from a perspective of somebody who was living there, or whose families were living there, and whose families were enmeshed in the social and cultural complexity of the place, what that conflict really looked like.
Well, it depends, of course, on one's exposure. I mean, there are people who lost family, there are people who lost homes. Our apartment was destroyed twice in the war, in 1976 and then the very end of the war, and both times, ironically and perversely, by the Lebanese army, shelling of the part of Beirut we were living in, which historically had been and still is, to an extent, a multi-religious, ecumenical space of Beirut. It's called Ras Beirut. And so the idea of being in that and being exposed to that shaped so much of how I am. But to go back to the issue of stereotypes, it's true that everyone stereotypes everyone else, and all cultures are involved in stereotyping, both internally and externally. The main difference between sort of, I would say, the stereotyping of the Middle East as opposed to Middle Eastern stereotypes of Europe or the West or America is that one has an extraordinary effect on the other. In other words, European and American stereotypes and Orientalist representations of the Middle East, of the Arab world in particular, is hugely consequential, because the US and Europe before the US has been involved in shaping so much of the world that I grew up in, both negatively, unfortunately, but also, to the extent that there was positive, it was also positive, but it was overwhelmingly negative in terms of geopolitical terms, whereas the opposite does not obtain. In other words, Arab stereotypes of the West are basically stereotypes.
They're politically much more harmless. I just wanted to point that out because it's so different to see it's so important to see the difference between a distant perception and a perception that becomes the ground for political action, or for any action, or for interaction. Then these stereotypes must change. But one has very strongly the feeling that hasn't happened.
Yes, for sure, because if you're living, I don't know, are you in Austria or in Germany?
I'm in Vienna.
If you're in Vienna. So somebody who thinks about Vienna and has a certain idea of what Vienna is, as opposed to somebody actually living in Vienna. I mean, there's a world, as you know perfectly well, there's a world of difference. And it's basically the one-dimensional representation of a part of the world that inevitably, in the Middle Eastern case, in the Arab case, in the Lebanese case, that inevitably gets flattened to a very one-dimensional idea of what religion is. So people think of diversity in the Middle East only in terms of religious difference, not in terms of ideological difference, not in terms of class difference, not in terms of social difference, not in terms of geographical difference, but simply in terms of religious difference, which is always interpreted in negative terms. And so I think that's one of the most obvious points, which breaks down as soon as you start living in a world where obviously things are vastly more interesting and beautiful and complicated than simply a one-dimensional representation of religious violence.
It would be quite an interesting historical study, I think, to see how Europe's perception of other cultures in terms of religion had to do with the fact that the religious wars were particularly brutal when Europe started its colonial.
100%. Yeah, so it's a projection also of European history.
Yes, it's a total projection of European history, of European ways of seeing. But before we come to those ways of seeing, one of the things that I found so interesting in your research is that you begin your research before that obtains, before that applies, still in the Ottoman Empire, and let's not forget the Middle East is sort of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, or grew out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. But you wrote a book called The Age of Coexistence, where you describe a world that was very different. It makes me think of what a friend of mine observed, Ivan Krastev, who was a political scientist, who said it was one of the great ironies of Europe that in the post-war time, the mono-ethnic west of Europe became multi-ethnic, whereas the utterly mixed east of Europe, from before the war, multicultural Europe, became mono-ethnic, and really they swapped their cultural identities. Now, when we look at the Ottoman Empire, at the Ottoman Middle East, that was very much a culture of cultures, a society that allowed difference under certain conditions, such as special taxes or other special obligations, but it allowed difference and it allowed coexistence, and it allowed that amazing interconnecting of identities on so many levels that you've already described.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think without romanticizing it, I think the key is to appreciate the fact that there is an extraordinarily long and diverse history of coexistence, and a dynamic form of coexistence that varied from place to place, century to century, town to town, and so on and so forth. But that changed radically when the Ottoman Empire and previous empires, of course, in the region, the previous Islamic empires, but really the Ottoman Empire, when the Ottoman Empire, which had inherited this idea of being an empire of diverse subjects, switches or tries to transform itself in the 19th century, and this is really where my work, the heart of my work has been, switches or tries to transform itself into becoming an empire of citizens, or at least nominal citizens, in the mid-19th century. And that transformation occurs at a time when European powers, particularly Great Britain, but also France and Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all begin to intervene in major ways in the internal affairs of the empire, claiming to speak on behalf of this or that minority or this or that community, and involving themselves and, in a sense, politicizing in ways that these had not been before the very fabric of coexistence in the Ottoman Empire that leads to ultimately the dissolution of the empire.
When you said it switched to try to become an empire of citizens, I mean, that's a trick that the Habsburg Empire didn't succeed in all that well. What motivated that? Was that a sort of generational thrust of modernization that we associate with the Young Turks, or what motivated that change in governing ethos, really?
Yeah, it's before the Young Turks. It's really the early to mid 19th century, and there are several reasons that motivated that shift in the 19th century. Because it's one thing to talk about coexistence without equality, without citizenship, which had been the rule and norm before the 19th century, into a form or a history of coexistence in the context of an imperial regime or an imperial government or an empire, in the case of the Ottomans, trying to preserve their territorial integrity and trying to figure out ways of fending off European intrusion, and at the same time trying to keep together what had been always an extraordinarily dynamic and pluralist form of social fabric and landscape together as the empire modernized in the 19th century. And so the motivations were both external, as in keep the Europeans from meddling in our internal affairs. That's the external reason. The internal reason was more the Ottomans were confronting a number of rebellions and challenges from within, whether it was the Greek War of Independence or what the Ottomans called a Greek revolt, or whether it was the rise of Muhammad Ali in Egypt, an Egyptian governor, and the wake of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. All these precipitated an Ottoman realization that the old ways were no longer sufficient and that there had to be a fundamental reordering of the empire. And of course, the point to make in all this is that the reordering helps to shift an empire of subjects into an empire of nominal citizens. In other words, the idea of saying, no, we're going to create a new sense of being Ottoman as equal citizens, irrespective of religious difference. But the fundamental primary motivation for this reformation was the attempt to militarily cohere and protect and defend and keep united the Ottoman Empire. So in other words, it was geopolitics, not some sense of a realization of the need for equality as an ideal, but really the need to preserve the empire. And that's always been the priority. It was always the priority. So so the geopolitics really is what mattered more so than anything else.
So what happened? Did the Ottoman Empire get overtaken by history in the midst of this process?
I mean, it's as people who live in the global South and anyone who lives in smaller countries will know. It's one thing to be able to modernize, and as Europeans, of course, should know if they knew their history. It's one thing to modernize, on your own terms, within your own sovereignty, without external interference. It's quite another thing to try to do this when other powers, especially European powers, are intervening constantly to undermine the very project of unity. So the Europeans, by claiming to protect various Christian communities in the Ottoman Empire, undermined, by definition, the very notion of trying to cohere this idea of an empire of citizens, because people ultimately are going to, everywhere in the world, are going to choose what is most advantageous to them in a particular moment. And so the great question for the empire was how to preserve its territorial integrity while making this transformation. Not easy. On the other hand, the great question for its subjects was, do we want to commit to this empire as it's going through this transformation when there are other options beckoning us, for example, allying ourselves with various European powers? And so that really ultimately haunted the Eastern question, in other words, or this European claim to protect minorities in the Middle East. This is really what haunted and ultimately undermined the project of creating an empire of citizens, which, of course, as a historian you'll know, is also a contradiction. The empire of citizens itself has a contradiction, because empires, by definition, are unequal and hierarchical. And the idea of being an empire of equal citizens was always a difficult project.
Also, in the interest of telling history in all its complexity, you said yourself you didn't want to idealize. You also have written a book called The Culture of Sectarianism, where you look into the fact that the relationships between the different groups today, people say communities, which always annoys me slightly, because I don't think many of people who were lumped together feel like part of a community, but these groups, be they social or religious or ethnic perhaps, didn't always have easy relationships during the Ottoman Empire either.
No, I mean, exactly. I mean, the whole idea of talking about sects as in religious communities, whatever, how difficult that term is or how annoying that term may be, the reality is, of course, that people in the Ottoman Empire didn't necessarily identify in these monolithic, one-dimensional terms. They would identify, of course, depending on where they lived, as villagers or as townsmen or as living in a particular quarter, in addition to having families, in addition to having kinship, in addition to having religious and professional. I mean, there's so many different levels and layers of identity that, again, get reduced to a one-dimensional perspective, especially when people outside or even people in government are trying to classify something for simplicity's sake. And so the point is that people in Lebanon, which is what I wrote my first book on, Ottoman Lebanon, it's not that people were Maronite or for example, Maronite Christian or Druze in a singular way, because a Maronite Christian in the north of what is today Lebanon was not the same as a Maronite Christian living in the south of what is today Lebanon. And, there were feudal relations, there were kinship relations with their neighbors, Muslim and Druze, and so on and so forth. It was a very complicated world with a lot of interconnections. However, the shift in the mid-19th century, to make a long story short, of the Ottoman Empire, when it tries to transform from being an empire of subjects to being an empire of citizens, inevitably there was what we would call today a backlash. In other words, there were those communities or those people who felt left out by this transformation and felt that the older system, the older cultural values, the older norms were ones that they were more familiar with, and they wanted to hold on to these. And it's in this context of imperial transformation, European intervention, massive economic transformations in the empire as free trade was opened up especially to British goods. In this context, there were these riots that took place, unprecedented riots that took place in cities like Damascus in 1816, in which Christian subjects were killed. Foreign missionaries were also killed. European consulates were also attacked. But it was basically a riot that took place in July of 1860. It was the largest anti-Christian riot that took place in the history of Ottoman Syria. And I spent a lot of time focusing on that in my first book, and actually in Age of Coexistence as well, because the point of that is that it was an exceptional moment of breakdown. It's not the norm. In fact, it's the opposite of the norm. It's actually when the norm was breaking down and fraying. And in a moment of loss of control, there were these riots that took place, and it's true, many Christians were killed, and it's important as a historian or as any scholar to be able to delve into these moments as objectively as possible, not to deny them and not to pretend they didn't happen, but to also realize not to sensationalize them. And so much of the Orientalist literature fixated on this massacre in Damascus in July of 1860 as evidence of what they considered the Muslim inability to modernize, ignoring completely the history of the United States, the history of European empires, where massacres on a vastly greater scales were occurring constantly. And that's one of the realizations as a historian, why context and why comparative history is so important, or relational history, is when I realized I grew up being taught a sort of mythical history of Europe and the United States, because that's the educational system that most people get exposed to, typically.
I think we all did.
Yeah, Europe is the French Revolution, it's whatever it is, it's this and that, and the United States is the Constitution and blah blah blah, all these things that you get taught, and of course all the darker sides, or the more violent and vicious sides, was completely suppressed. And it was astonishing for me, because then you grow up thinking, how can I explain this massacre in Damascus in 1860? And especially when that reality is being orientalized on the one hand and being compared to an ideal of Europe or the West. And that's one of the things that I've been pushing back against more than anything else. We should absolutely investigate and explore these moments, whether turning points or not. We should absolutely investigate them in all their detail and with complete honesty and integrity. On the other hand, we cannot simply explore them against a backdrop or a context where we're idealizing the West, because that is extraordinarily dangerous, because it leads to all sorts of, the framing is incorrect, the conclusions inevitably are distorted, rather than seeing this as an exceptional moment, and rather than understanding how it is that something like this could unfold and what happened in its aftermath. Because the point about the massacres is that, yes, it was an exceptional, terrible moment, but the reality is that it was followed by decades of renewed coexistence in the late, especially in the Mashriq, in the Arab East, in Damascus, Aleppo, Beirut, Sidon, Jerusalem, and so on and so forth.
I think this is very important, because also this idealizing perspective is still with us in terms of, I can only speak for Europeans, being one of a considerable European smugness that is very often quite unaware of existing. I was speaking to someone, I was giving a lecture in Italy, and I was speaking to someone who said, but if we can learn anything from history, then perhaps that societies that are open, that are innovative, that are democratic, that are secular, or more or less secular, have always been more successful if you look at Europe, at the US. And I said, yes, that's true, but these are also all societies that practiced colonialism and had slaves. And that also had a lot to do with their success and their enormous economic. And he was very surprised. He was quite honestly surprised at this perspective, and he didn't deny it, but it had never occurred to him. And it seems to me that in post-war Europe, and also now with the considerable change in our historical reality, Western Europe is fighting with its sense that it was richer than anyone else and more stable and more peaceful than anyone else because of its unique virtues. And if everybody else would only catch up to being as virtuous as they were, then the world could live in an ideal state. And this certainty is being considerably rattled at the moment.
For sure. And also the exact parallel to that is the US myth about the greatness of the United States and America and how wonderful it is, and everyone else in the world should imitate the US.
The greatest democracy in the world.
Exactly. All these absurd mantras. And then, of course, you look at what's going on now, the crisis in the United States, and we can see, first of all, not only how absurd and ahistorical these completely mischievous claims are, but also how untenable they are and how short-lived they are, in fact, in terms of if you put Europe and the United States in historical context. Let's see how long this smugness, as you put it, is going to last in the face of reality, which is that the world is vastly more interconnected and interdependent.
Now let's get to this turning point, because this is where your history of the Middle East comes onto a different tangent. We are in 1919. The First World War is just over. Two empires in the center of Europe have been shattered. The Ottoman Empire has also collapsed, and there is land up for grabs. There are lots of interested parties, colonial powers, imperial powers, but obviously also local powers. There's also another actor, which is the young movement of Zionism, with Jewish people who have moved to Palestine to establish originally agricultural colonies where they worked and where they often lived in good peace with their neighbors. But things are now changing through the dynamics of history. Take us a little bit into that process and into the extraordinary story of the peace talks and the fact-finding mission that then went out to find what do the people actually want.
Yeah, I mean, this is I'm writing, as you know, I'm writing a book about this subject right now, and the last colonialism, in a sense, the idea of what happens in Paris in 1919 and in Palestine as well. Because there's so much to say in this, but if I had to reduce it to a nutshell, I mean, obviously this is the era, as you said, after the Great War, after the First World War, after the collapse of the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire as well, and then, of course, the Ottoman Empire. So all these empires collapse, and the idea of the Paris Peace Conference was allegedly led by the spirit of Woodrow Wilson. The notion, at least that we were told, or we have been taught, is that this was allegedly about making the world safer for democracy and instilling the idea of self-determination in the world, especially in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. And the realities, of course, was very different, in the sense that in Paris in 1919, the British and the French and other minor, allied powers and the US assembled together to essentially divvy up the spoils of war. And it was more a colonial conference than a peace conference, in the sense that the idea, of course, was not only to punish Germany, but really to dispossess the European powers of their colonies, and to partition the Ottoman Empire in particular. So not just to strip the Ottomans of their provinces, but to actually partition the entirety of the Ottoman Empire into bits and pieces. And now I'm still researching and writing, so a lot of what I'm saying now you can push back and we can discuss, because I'm still thinking through these ideas. But it strikes me quite clearly that the Ottoman aspect of the so-called Paris Peace Conference, which really was a colonial conference when viewed from the non-Western perspective, the idea of that conference was clearly to dismember any kind of polity in the Middle East, and at the same time to punish Germany. In other words, to punish the German by taking Alsace-Lorraine away, by stripping Germany of its colonies. But unless you would know more than me as a historian of in Europe right now, in Vienna, my sense is that Germany itself wasn't partitioned completely into bits and pieces.
No, Germany wasn't partitioned. It lost lands in the east.
Yeah, for sure.
It lost the Alsace, but it did have territorial losses. I think what was the really important thing, and by the way, and an interesting thing today to remember, of the Versailles Conference was the fact that Germany and to some extent Austria had to shoulder the exclusive responsibility for the war.
Yeah, and also the indemnities.
The indemnities, which were terrible, but also the moral guilt of the war. And, in contemporary historical analysis, the reasons for the war also look a lot more complex than simply there was bad Kaiser Willy who was running around wanting a war with someone. There were a lot of colonial powers that had interest in this conflict. And, you can argue that simply the technological innovation completely overwhelmed the strategic planning and therefore made this war perpetuate itself in a way that nobody had anticipated. But with regard to the Middle East, I defer to you, but it seems very strongly that there is no desire to have an independent political actor on the southeastern flank of Europe.
Not at all. And the idea was to partition it into bits and pieces.
And Mrs. Sykes-Picot did very good work there, and that is still fondly remembered there. There were two colonial officials who simply drew borders on the map, not caring at all about the political lie of the land and what these borders would cause, as so many colonial borders have done. But take us a little bit through what happened in Arab society when these things were going on in Muslim, Christian, Arab society.
I will, but let me just stop at the colonial conference in Paris, the so-called peace conference, because the point is there that this French and British partition, Sykes-Picot you mentioned of 1916, but it really is, by the time we get to the peace conference in 1919, there's a different reality. There's a British occupation of much of the Arab East. There is the collapse of the Ottoman Empire effectively by this period, certainly the surrender of the Ottomans in the war. There is the Arab revolt that's taken place in 1916, and so you have an Arab Hashemite leader who's installed in Damascus, Faisal, who's the son of Sharif Hussein, with whom the British had corresponded in 1915 and promised the Arabs an independent kingdom, a unified independent kingdom across what we today would call the Arab East, in return for Arab aid fighting against the Ottomans. And so Sharif Hussein, who was in Mecca, rebelled against the sovereign, the Ottoman state, and led an Arab revolt with British aid, of course, and it helped to drive the Ottomans out of Palestine and Syria and Lebanon, what we today call Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. And at the end of the war, the Sharif and his son Faisal asked the British to live up to their wartime commitments as allies, since they said, after all, we were allies with you. We were not subjects. We were allies, and so we deserve to be treated as allies at the Paris Peace Conference. And of course, but the problem is that the British had already promised the French to divide up and partition. And we all know, in a sense, anyone who knows a basic sense of history understands that in the end, the spirit of Sykes-Picot is what triumphed. And so at Paris in 1919, you have the British and the French who were absolutely determined to partition the spoils of war, to colonize the Arab East. And at the same time, they had to deal with all these various non-Western claims about self-determination that they were absolutely going to ignore. And at the same time, they had to deal with this problematic US president called Woodrow Wilson, who is often identified with self-determination, with this idea of self-determination, but who himself, as scholars will know, especially scholars of US history will know, was extraordinarily committed to racial hierarchy, to segregation, didn't believe at all in equality, but at the same time at least had a sense that the First World War had been caused by this sort of imperial scramble, and that something had to be set up to prevent another such war, hence the League of Nations. And so at least there was some sense that Wilson had, as racist as he was in reality, there was some sense that he had that at least the native peoples of the world had to be brought in at some level. There had to be some level of consent. And so it's hardly self-determination in the way we understand the term today, but it was at least a sense of the old system. It was unworkable, and the Great War proved how unworkable it was, so we needed a new system. That's the best one can say about Wilson, even though he wasn't, of course, in any way, shape, or form committed to freedom of peoples around the world, or democracy, or liberation, or self-determination in its modern meaning. He was committed to something else entirely. U.S. power and a projection of that power overseas, and an understanding at least that the old system was unworkable. And so at Paris, all these various non-Western peoples, including the Arabs, go to Paris trying to lobby the Wilson in particular, but anyone who would listen, frankly, to live up to this idea of self-determination. And this is what's interesting, Philip, is that in 1919, there's already a huge split. The vast majority of the non-Western world understood self-determination to mean what we understand it to mean today. In other words, independence or freedom. The Western powers and the US understood self-determination to mean something else entirely, a very limited form that was to be applied almost exclusively to Europe. And to the extent that it was going to be applied to the non-West, it would be hierarchical. It would necessitate European or Western oversight, hence the mandate system that's enshrined in Article 22 of the League of Nations, and that it wasn't about freedom. It was about a new form of European or Western tutelage. And so this was a struggle. The Europeans wanted to partition the Arab East and divide up this region. The British wanted what would become Iraq, and they wanted what would become Palestine. The French wanted what would become Syria and Lebanon. And they were clear about this. They just had to deal with this issue of, okay, what do we do with self-determination, especially since someone like Faisal, who was a son of the Sharif Hussein, was in Paris lobbying for the Allies to live up to their wartime commitments. So in the end, a compromise was reached in Paris. It was that a fact-finding mission would be sent to what is today Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, this whole region, the Arab East. A fact-finding commission would be sent there in 1919 to ask people, the inhabitants of the Arab East or the Middle East or the Mashriq, what it is and how it is they envisioned their own political future. And I think that is really important, Philip, because it's the first time that I'm aware of that an international body was sent off to the non-Western world to ask them how they wanted to determine their own political future in the context of Article 22 of the League of Nations that was setting up a mandate system.
So you need to have a boss, but you can have some say in who that boss is going to be.
Not just that, but also we're still going, even though you're going to need to have a boss or a mandatory power, but at least A, you have some say in that, but B, irrespective, we're still going to ask you objectively what it is that you want. How is it that you envision your political future? And it was meant to be an inter-allied commission. It was meant to be a US, British, French, and Italian commission that was going to be sent off. The French, of course, absolutely objected because their point was, this is an absurd exercise. Once the British and the French agree, then we can ask them, but only after we've agreed. To which Wilson actually said, well, that makes no sense. Then what's the point of asking them if we've already agreed? The point is to ask them first. Otherwise, it makes no sense. And the British played their usual, I would say, duplicitous, or if I'm going to use a diplomatic term, whatever the term is, they sort of hedged their bets. They basically used the French. I mean,
non-committal, perhaps.
No, it wasn't non-committal. They were very much committed to the British Empire and to expanding and to seizing colonies. They used the French as the sort of the bad cop, and they were the good cop kind of thing. They played this tag team with the French to basically tell the Americans, yes, they would go along with this commission, but in the end, they didn't. And the only people who went were the Americans, quite interestingly, in 1919. And the US, remember, didn't have bases in the Middle East at the time, didn't have any geopolitical interests in the region, really. And so other than missionary schools and universities and institutions throughout this region. And that's the primary reason why Wilson even thought about this region, was because of the missionaries who were there, who also, by the way, lobbied for, at least some of them, lobbied for a fact-finding commission. So the Arabs lobbied for a fact-finding commission. The missionaries, at least a leading missionary by the name of Howard Bliss, who was the president of what is today the American University of Beirut, also lobbied for a fact-finding mission in line with self-determination. And Wilson agreed. And once Wilson agreed to this commission, the other European powers had to go along because they couldn't defy him openly. And so the commission was sent. And the bottom line is that this is a historic commission that tours Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, going all the way up into what's today Turkey. And they ask people on the ground, and they collect thousands of petitions, many of which are still preserved, by the way, in the archives. And I'm writing about this now. And they come up with this extraordinary report. They write this report. They say, you know what, we toured this region. Frankly, given the fact that, the League of Nations wants to create this new world committed to this idea of self-determination, the reality is that the majority of the people, the vast majority of the people in this Arab East, in these former Ottoman provinces, in what is today Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, Jordan, they all speak the same language, overwhelmingly Arabic. They more or less have the same culture. They have the same manners. there's no reason, if we're taking their interests at heart, to divide them up. If we're going to be true, if this is really, and this is an extraordinary document in that sense, that they say this all in 1919, in August 1919, they write this all out. They say there's no reason to split this up at all, because if we care about their interests, which is what we claim to care about with this new sort of mandate system and the League of Nations, then there is no logic to divide them up. That's the first thing they say. The second thing they say is that insofar as there has to be a foreign power, a mandate, a mandatory power that's going to tutor them or oversee them, well, the vast majority of people want the United States, because the United States doesn't have an imperial presence in this part of the world. They certainly do not want France, because France had a wretched record in North Africa, in Algeria, and other parts of the world. It was known to be a brutal anti-Muslim power. And failing the United States, perhaps Britain, but really it's the United States that people want. And the third recommendation they made, and this, by the way, it's all in the records, in the archives. The third recommendation they made was, they said, we came to Palestine, they said, completely open to the idea of Zionism, this idea of recreating a Jewish entity or polity or state or project in Palestine. They were sympathetic, they said. They arrived sympathetic because they were Americans and they were Christian. They were all Christian. The Protestant, the commissioners, the lead commissioners, and it's known as the King Crane Commission, after Henry King, who was the president of Oberlin, and Charles Crane, who was a philanthropist and who sat on many missionary boards. And so they toured this area, and they said, we were sympathetic to Zionism, but once we got to Palestine, we saw that the vast majority of people here are Arab. And the vast majority of people throughout the region are completely opposed to the idea of turning Palestine over to the building of a Jewish state, because they see it as completely unfair and totally in contradiction with self-determination. And we agree, they said, with that conclusion, because there's no way you can't reconcile self-determination with Zionism in Palestine, given the fact that the Jewish population of Palestine was a tiny population compared to the vast majority of the Muslim and Christian Arab population. And so they said, look, there are sometimes in history, this is one of the famous lines of the report, where they say decisions requiring force are sometimes necessary in history. But they go on to say, but surely not in the interests of a serious injustice. Because that's what Zionism is to the population on the ground in Palestine. And so there is no way we can, in good faith, support this project, because it is completely in violation of self-determination. So they called for unity, they said no colonialism, and they said no Zionism. At least no major Zionist project in Palestine. And they submitted the report, and the report was completely suppressed. It's an extraordinary story, totally suppressed. And then, of course, the British and the French divided up this region as they had intended all along. Wilson had a stroke, but in any case, he had lost interest. And the rest is the Middle East, in a sense, the making of the Middle East that we know today. It's deliberately partitioning a region that there was no reason to partition it if people had taken the interests of the people on the ground at heart.
Tell me, what broke up so many old political structures in Europe was nationalism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And that, of course, had a long intellectual history already, going back to the Romantics, but it was terribly virulent, terribly important, enormously constitutive for also the world we live in today. But also, of course, it spilled over beyond Europe very quickly, and it was taken up in some areas and regions much more strongly than others, which often has cultural reasons, historical reasons. What did this idea of state-based or ethnic-based nationalism do with with people in different Arab countries in the Middle East, shall we say at that point regions or areas in the Middle East?
I mean, it's an excellent question, Philip, and it's also a very difficult question to answer briefly, because of course there's an enormous difference in terms of thinking about what is a national how does one cohere and develop a national culture that transcends religious and ethnic difference, as opposed to saying we're going to create a national culture based on exclusive ethnic or exclusive ethno-religious identities. These are two different projects with radically different goals and outcomes. And so what's interesting to see is that in the Arab East, as a result of the Ottoman heritage, and arguably, of course, long before the Ottomans, going back to the very foundations of Islam, there was an ecumenical idea that eventually crystallized. It's not that it had to inevitably become a national project, because we know these are modern projects. But in the mid 19th century on into the 20th century, in this very moment I'm describing to you, there was this idea of trying to develop an Arab nation, and then even smaller than that, a Syrian nation, an Egyptian nation, an Iraqi nation, a Lebanese nation, and so on, a Palestinian nation, and so on and so forth. All these different, it depends on what scale we're talking about, but in almost all these instances in the Arab East, the idea was, how do you transcend religious difference? Because remember, they're all haunted by the 19th century, and they're haunted by the idea of sectarian or religious differences dividing people. So the question was, how do you overcome that without denying religious difference? And especially they were also mindful of how the European powers in the 19th century had so routinely exploited religious diversity to further divide people on the ground. And so the question was always how to cohere a national culture, whether it's in the Ottoman context or in the post-Ottoman context, and transcend religious difference. The problem for the Arabs, of course, is that with the mandate system, they had no sovereignty. So you had Syria that was created as a state, Lebanon is created as a state, Palestine is created as a state, Iraq, Mesopotamia is created as a state, Jordan, eventually Transjordan.
None of these entities existed like that before, and especially there was no image in people's heads of these entities existing like that.
Not entirely. I mean, there were ideas of Palestine, of Lebanon, Syria. I mean, the ideas are there, of course. It's not that they were completely invented, but
the national borders weren't.
Yeah, certainly not as completely hermetically sealed, geopolitically independent entities. And remember, these are entities that are not only created by the British and the French, but also created in ways that serve British and French imperial interests. So the idea is, before then, people could travel. And I often say this, our history is in our names, in the sense that my name is Makdisi, my last name is Makdisi, which means of Jerusalem. Because the whole point is that people from Lebanon, and that's my father's name and my father's Lebanese, people could travel from what is today Lebanon to Palestine, to Syria, to Egypt, and go back and forth. There were no borders in that sense. It's the Europeans who come in and create these hard and fast borders. Again, not in the interests of the people, but in the interests of the various competing European powers, to say, okay, this is our land, this is our control, you control the other side. And we need to figure out where we're going to draw the line. It's the Europeans who do this after World War I. And that has, of course, profound effects, because the point is that these states, the mandates, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, as well as the non-mandatory states like Egypt, they had no real sovereignty, because it's the British or the French who dominated and controlled the affairs of those states. The antithesis to that, of course, is what becomes the state of Turkey, the Republic of Turkey, that emerges after the First World War, after the Armenian Genocide, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, in the context of the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, later known as, who leads a war of independence against the same kind of European partition of Turkey. The difference is that Mustafa Kemal and the Turkish nationalists are absolutely determined to drive out not just the Europeans, but they go to war, in a sense, against religious and ethnic diversity in their own state, because they have in mind what happened in the 19th century. And it's extraordinarily brutal in the sense that they together with the Greek state in 1923, as you know, 23, they carry out this this extraordinarily cruel forced population exchange, where Turkey expels 1 million Greeks, Christians in other words, who had been living in what had been the Ottoman Empire for centuries. They're expelled to Greece because they're, quote, Greek, even though they weren't Greek nationalists, but they were Orthodox Christians, but they're identified with Greece. So you ship them off to Greece. And the Greeks expel hundreds of thousands of Muslims to Turkey. I mean, and it's like you're uprooted from your villages, your towns, your cities. You're just uprooted on the basis of your ethno-religious identity, not your identity, but the identity that these two states have determined for you. And it's a vicious, horrible population exchange. And then, of course, the Turkish state goes to war against the Kurds, it goes to war against the Alevis and all these other minorities, but it ends up being sovereign. And this is a great problem, is that it ends up being geopolitically more powerful than the Arab states, more sovereign than the Arab states, but far more intolerant of religious and ethnic difference than the Arab states.
Ussama, there would be so much to unpack, but we are slowly running out of time, and I do want to come to something that preoccupies me a lot. You mentioned the word Orientalism, taken from a very important book that your uncle wrote, Edward Said. And I mean, what is Orientalism for people who may not have heard the word? I think I better let you explain it, but it is seeing the stereotype of the Oriental in everything that happens in that kind of region, and that is, how would you quickly describe it? Because I want us to make a jump into the present.
The weaponization of knowledge to further imperial interests is the simplest way of putting it. The weaponization of the idea of Orient and Occident, East and West, these extremely artificial binaries to advance and further the goals of Western empire.
I'm asking also because in view of what's happening in Gaza and the systematic starving of people, there is systematic destruction of the lives of the people in that part of Palestine. You have spoken very strongly about the cruelty of Western states, and what I notice is that in Germany, people who, I mean, there would be a lot to discuss here. There's a lot of propaganda that is indeed in itself perhaps genocidal, but there's a lot of simple support for Palestinian lives and Palestinian people, and a lot of simple assertions that you should not kill people by starving them to death. And that is met with very stiff state opposition in Germany. It has been criminalized in the form of Palestine Action in Britain, and people who even articulate something like that are threatened with 14 years in jail. You know what's happened with the weaponization of the accusation of anti-Semitism in American universities and by the Trump administration, where this has become the ultra-cynical ploy to silence or dissent. How do you see this cruelty of the Western state in regard to the plight of the people who are at the moment suffering through this campaign?
I mean, it's tied to what we're talking about. In the end, I mean, again, it's an excellent. I mean, first of all, what's happening in Gaza and to the Palestinians in Gaza is shocking. It's unconscionable. The idea of even saying that you have to say to me that the starving of children or people is unacceptable. The idea that this is even a remotely controversial statement is absurd and obscene, and it shows you just how dehumanized a certain part of the world has been, our part of the world, the Arab East has been, and the Palestinians in particular. But it ties to everything I've been saying earlier, in the sense that the idea of this is what the German state and all these other European powers and the United States are still in denial of. The idea of creating an ethno-religious nationalist state, a Jewish state in Palestine, which is a multi-religious place, has always been multi-religious for centuries and centuries and centuries. The idea of imposing this after the First World War, in violation of all ideas of self-determination, and of course in violation of the vast majority of the native populations.
And their stated interests.
And their state, of course, all that. And it was all obvious. I mean, it was so obvious. And the British themselves, in their colonial memoranda, acknowledged as much. They said there's no way to reconcile self-determination with our support for Zionism. That's what Balfour himself said in 1919. The project itself, of course, was coercive and forced on the native population, and eventually leads to their expulsion in 1948, in the Nakba of 1948. And of course, we're still dealing with this problem, which is to say, by what right does one create an ethno-religious nationalist state by force of arms in a part of the world that is profoundly multi-religious? Okay, that's one question. Then you get to the idea of people, of course. The Palestinians have not, even though many of them have been expelled, many of them remain on their lands or on lands to which they were expelled, as in Gaza, many of the people there who are being starved are the descendants of people who were expelled from their homes around what is today the Gaza Strip. And the idea that the Western world after World War II, and especially Germany and Britain and France, all these European nations basically claimed, and this is, I've talked about this in other talks and discussions, claimed to have resolved their problem of anti-Semitism. In other words, a Western problem of anti-Semitism, which is where the very term itself comes from. And the history, of course, of the 19th and 20th centuries, everyone knows, is a history of European anti-Semitism. They claim to have resolved their problem of anti-Semitism by embracing the new state of Israel, a Jewish state in a multi-religious part of the world, at the expense of the Palestinians. That has been the heart of the extraordinary hypocrisy involved in this entire question. And once you commit to this, then people double down and double down and double down, to the point where now we've reached this point where, in the name of protecting this state, there's an actual campaign, a genocide taking place in Gaza, an actual obliteration of an entire society before our eyes, starvation before our eyes, the killing of teachers, of journalists, of children, of doctors, of destruction of it's all unconscionable. And even the Western claims, everything the West claims to stand for, is being eroded before our eyes to the point where it's indefensible. And they'd rather sacrifice all their, I don't know, it's to me, it's appalling, and it's precisely why one needs to be, first and foremost, before one being a scholar or a historian, one has to be a human being with a sense of justice and decency and a sense of a common future. This is unsustainable. This kind of obliteration of people is unsustainable and criminal. And of course, we have to understand it both as humans and as people, but also as scholars, in the sense of where and how do we get to a point where the obliteration of an entire people is taking place before our eyes, and Western governments, for the most part, not every Western government, but the major Western governments, including Germany, have been so complicit. And so, then they're complicit for their own reasons, geopolitical, economic, whatever it is. And the interesting thing is that, as you said, on the ground among European publics, there's a shift, and in the US, actually, interestingly, there's a huge shift, because people around the world, including in the West, are simply not okay with a genocide. They're not okay with the starvation of people, no matter what the excuse is, especially when it's being live streamed, when everyone can see what's happening. I think that's what's interesting. It's so the idea, and this maybe we'll end on this point. It's so interesting because we often talk about the West, but of course there's a huge difference between the official Western representatives and what people on the ground who are in the West and of the West and represent a very different kind of West today are saying and seeing. And so I don't know how one reconciles these two things, but I mean, ideally, I think it doesn't take one being Western or Eastern or Muslim or Christian or Jewish or anything to recognize that what's going on in Gaza is simply unacceptable.
Ussama, also for reasons of running out of time, very simply, we will end on this point. Perhaps we have an opportunity to continue this conversation. Obviously, the question that's still missing is, as you just said, the common future, which will have to happen because nobody's going anywhere, finally. And that was what I earlier wanted to say about the Peace of Versailles. The greatest problem was that if you destroy and humiliate a people that is ultimately not going anywhere, you are going to create the next war. And the kind of accommodation that there may be possible after this war, which will have to finish like all wars do, that will be something that will merit many a discussion, and I hope we may have the opportunity to talk about that again. But for today, Ussama Makdisi, thank you very much for enlightening us about the history of the Middle East.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye. This was another BlomCast. I thank you for listening. You can subscribe, you can even buy me a coffee, but you can certainly tell everybody about this BlomCast, because isn't it fantastic? So be here next time. Thanks for being here now.